To be here with you this morning. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This has already been a momentous occasion for me. I don't know that I've ever had a day dedicated to me. So, yeah, it's pretty awesome. So, thank you very much for that. I want to thank a few people before I get started. First of all, San Diego Association of Realtors, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this inaugural event. Again, it's quite an honor to be here. Kim, Desmond, thank you for your remarks. And you know, when you kind of get in your mind what you're going to say when you give a speech. And I heard a lot of buzzwords in Kim's remarks, which were just fantastic. And I think you've kind of put me on a different course this morning, because I heard obligation, I heard ancestors, I heard history and carrying your history forward. And so that's going to be infused into my remarks this morning. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Please give her another hand for this. Of course, I have to thank my good friend, Mary Beth. Will you please stand up for making this connection and bringing me here? Also would like to thank Corey Shepard for inviting me to be the keynote this morning. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. And as I was introduced, I think I heard Spencer say I'm the great-great-great-grandson of Fredrick Douglass, and also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. That's a whole lot of greats. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, can you imagine having to introduce yourself the great-great-great-great? But it sometimes makes me feel like I'm far removed. And you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know or knew a grandparent, and some of you may have even known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 101 years old. She met Fredrick Douglass when she was a little girl. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, lived to be 94, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting at the knee of my great-grandmother Fanny, as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him the man with the great big white hair. Yeah. And I remember sitting at the knee of my Aunt Portia, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And when we started our work at the Fredrick Douglass Family Initiatives in 2007, we immediately turned to schools and classrooms and got in front of students, and they would all look at me kind of cross-eyed, like, man, you were so far removed. And what does all of this history have to do with our lives today? And why are you talking about these people that lived so long ago? And so I wanted to give them some context to help them wrap their minds around the distance between the generations. And I had this thought that I think was kind of profound, that hands that touched the great Fredrick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine.
Amen.
So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from each man, I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country when you consider the generations. And so I'm going to talk to you this morning about two men who were born into slavery. They were born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to, but yet through the power of education. And for Fredrick Douglass, who later in life became a statesman, he was the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American Recorder of Deeds in the District of Columbia, first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor, and the list goes on and on and on. And people would ask him, they'd say, Fredrick, I need to know, where did you go to school? Where did you get that education? And having never spent one day of his life in a classroom, no formal education, because we know from our U.S. history that it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write, he would have to steal his education. Both of my ancestors would have to steal their education, and they would ask him that question, and he would respond on occasion by saying, my diploma is written on my back.
Amen.
My diploma is written on my back. Both of my ancestors understood from a very young age that education was going to be their pathway to freedom. That education equals liberation. Education equals emancipation. And that message is infused into the work that we do at our organization, which I'll talk about a little bit later in my remarks. But I just wanted to set that up because I have a unique connection to history. There's no doubt about that. I remember my grandmother telling me when I was very young, she said, you need to know where you come from in order to know where you're headed. And I've always kept that in my spirit and my soul in the work that we do. So Black History Month, I was sitting in the back and I saw a picture of Dr. Carter G. Woodson on the screen. And another question that I'll get from students when they meet me is, so why do we celebrate Black History Month in February? And I'll turn the question back to them. And usually their answer is, well, it's the shortest month of the year that they gave us. Well, it is the shortest month of the year, but nothing was given to us. We took Black History Month because Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1926 wanted to infuse Black history into the curriculum, and he created a week called Negro History Week. And he chose the second week of February because it was Abraham Lincoln's birthday on the 12th and Fredrick Douglass's birthday on the 14th. So that's why we celebrate Black History Month in February. So that week evolved into Black History Month or African American History Month. Fredrick didn't know when he was born. He chose February 14th as his birthday because his mother, whom he only saw 4 or 5 times his whole life, used to call him her little Valentine. So that's why we celebrate Black History Month in February. So I get 2 questions all the time. I already got them this morning, these same questions I get. So you're related to Fredrick Douglass and to Booker T. Washington? Well, what do you do? And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. So if you can imagine, there's this kind of weight of expectation that I've carried on my shoulders most of my life to try and step out of the shadow of my ancestors. And I'll talk about how it is that I came to be able to even stand up in front of an audience and tell these stories today. The other question that I get all the time, so Fredrick Douglass and Booker T. Washington were not related to each other. How is it you're related to both of them? Anybody wondering that question? Yeah. Well, it happened on my mother's side of the family. It's all on my mom's side. So my mother's mother, Nettie Hancock Washington, was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. My mother's father, Fredrick Douglass III, was Fredrick Douglass's great-grandson. And so my grandparents met in 1941 at Tuskegee Institute, which is a school that Booker T. Washington founded in 1881 at the age of 25. My grandfather was a surgeon, and he had been commissioned down there by the Veterans Administration during World War II. My grandmother had been born in the hospital on campus, but she was living in California at the time, just happened to come home for summer vacation, decided that she wanted to meet some friends on campus. My grandfather decided this one evening that he was going to eat in the student cafeteria where he had never eaten before. So he's strolling across campus, and my grandmother is rushing to meet friends, and they literally bumped into each other. Didn't know that the other descended from an historic family, and they fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married just 3 months later. So it truly was a love story, perhaps meant to be that they come together. But I'm the father of 2 daughters, now 28 and 25, and I told them from a very young age, never get married. I see young people over here today, students. Get to know the person a little bit. But that's how it happened. It truly was a love story. I was with my mom a couple of days ago. My mom, Nettie Washington Douglass, is the person that united the bloodlines of the families. And she said that people thought her whole life that it was an arranged marriage because of these 2 historic families, but it wasn't. They literally came together. So Fredrick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his father was his enslaver. Never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was about 6 or 7 years old. Used to sleep head first in an old corn sack with his feet hanging out on cold winter nights because that was the only way he could try and keep himself warm, and he would sleep in a tiny closet. As I mentioned, he only saw his mother 4 or 5 times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sunup to sundown, walk 12 miles in the middle of the night, and then spend just a few precious moments with him until he would fall asleep. And then she would walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to face punishment. But he did have someone early in his life that showed him some love, nurturing, and care, and that was his grandmother, Betsy. And her job on the plantation was to raise the children until they were old enough to really begin their life in manual labor. And on this plantation, that was around 5 or 6 years old. And so when Fredrick was around that age, and I remember I said he didn't know his birthday, he spent his whole life not even knowing how old he was. 5 or 6 years old, his grandmother said, "Fred, we're gonna go on a long journey." And she had made this walk many times before with the other children. And this was really the first time she was doing it with her own flesh and blood. And so if you can imagine, that walk took a long time, and Fredrick was scared. He was nervous. She would carry him much of the way when his legs couldn't carry himself. And then when they would finally make that last mile walk from the road up to the plantation home, he would kind of wander off just to check out his surroundings and to look for something to eat. And when he turned back to look for his grandmother, she was gone. And he would never see her again. So you had this little boy that didn't know his mother, didn't know who his father was separated from his grandmother. He was separated from his 6 brothers and sisters. They were like strangers to him. So he truly was an orphan with no family, no home, and no country, because he was not considered a citizen of the United States as an enslaved person. But yet, in spite of all of that, he was able to rise up and to go on to effect change for all of us sitting here today. And I'll talk about how he was able to do that. He writes in his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Fredrick Douglass, an American Slave. He wrote, "I had this moment that I will describe as divine providence in my favor. And that was, I was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation. His enslaver owned more than 1,000 enslaved Africans. So it was a big plantation. There were lots of children, hundreds of children. He was chosen. He said, I was the first, last, and only choice to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's family. Now, the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wasn't around people that could teach him how to read and write, but now he was going to be in the big city. He was going to be in Baltimore. He would be around free black children. He would be around poor white children. But most importantly, when he gets there, his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, had never had a slave before. And she didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. And out of the kindness of her Christian heart, she began to teach young Fredrick how to read and write, his ABCs. And now that's the story that we've heard. But there's a really important nuanced point in the story that isn't often told. And that was this little boy, Fred Bailey, asked her to teach him. And I consider that his first instance of what would be self-emancipation. And so she just begins to teach him his ABCs. And the lessons continued for a little while until his enslaver, Hugh Auld, found out about him. And when he found out, he got mad. He got angry, and he looked at his wife, and he looked at young Fredrick, and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." Did you all hear that message? You cannot teach a slave to read and write because it will unfit him to be a slave. He'll be running away with himself. And Fredrick looked at his master and he thought to himself, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power, which is something we hear today, and that education equals freedom, education equals emancipation, education equals liberation, and he'll teach himself to read and write. And as I go through my remarks this morning, I don't want you to think about this as just history that was in the past, but how is that history relevant to what we're doing today? So I'm going to jump back and forth between history and what's happening today around education and what's happening in our communities. And so Fredrick was really clever in the way that he taught himself. Now, remember, he's interacting with the children in the neighborhood, and he used to carry in his pocket biscuits or bread, and he would trade that food for reading lessons. He also wrote in that autobiography, he said, "I was always so hungry as a slave child. I always had this pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when I would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a trough similar to what pigs would eat out of. And all of the children, including Fredrick, would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to eat what little food was in there. To eat like pigs, to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He did not own himself. And so if you think about this little boy that would trade something of such great importance, great value to him, food, for reading lessons. And the students always get it. They look at me and they say, "So Mr. Morris, what you're telling me is he would rather feed his mind and have his stomach go empty." And that's exactly what he did. And he would start to unfit himself to be a slave. He would start to ask questions like, "Why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And how come you know your birthday and I don't know mine? That's not fair." And then he would turn to God and he would pray for deliverance from his bondage. And he would say, "God, I don't understand how my master puts on a suit every Sunday and goes to church. And in the Word and Bible and cherry-picked scriptures and verses finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property."
Amen.
Not just talking about the past, talking about the present. He couldn't understand, and he already from a young age started to make the distinction between what he would call the slave-holding Christianity of the land versus the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. He understood from 8, 9 years old. And the work that we do in communities with young people, we want young people to start asking critical questions about their situations and conditions. And they'll ask questions like, "Well, why is it because I'm born into a certain zip code, I have less access and opportunity to equal housing, equal education, equal opportunity, versus somebody else in another zip code through no fault of their own? The playing field is not level." And when young people can start to think critically, and this is what the examples of my ancestors and all the other freedom fighters give to our young people today, when you present it in a way that they can understand it, and you help them to understand that the words that Fredrick Douglass and Booker T. Washington wrote are still as relevant today as they were all those years ago. And I say unfortunately, because there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And so Fredrick continues to self-educate himself, and he's growing, he's getting stronger. And so at the age of 15, he was sent to a slave breaker because they couldn't get him to do what they needed him to do. And so he was hired out for a full year. And he gets to Edward Covey's farm, and Covey begins to work him, and then he begins to beat him. And the beatings became more frequent. And after 6 months of taking brutal beatings, where Fredrick writes he was reduced to the level of a brute, but there was something in his spirit, in his soul, that wouldn't die. And after 6 months, he had had enough. And he rose up, and he and Covey had this epic 2-hour battle. It was more of a wrestling match than a fisticuffs, because Fredrick knew that he needed to be strategic, that he couldn't really hurt this guy or kill him, because he might have faced the same fate. So if you can get this visual of these two guys wrestling, and Fredrick again was a big young man, big and strong, and Covey's asking the other enslaved people to help, and they're saying, "No, we don't want any part of this." And after 2 months, Fredrick defeats Covey. He's standing over him, breathing heavily, and he looks at him and he said, "You now have seen how a boy was made a slave. Now you see how a slave was made a man." And while he wasn't physically free from the chains that bound him, he was on his way to being mentally free. And so at the age of 18, he would make his first attempt to run away. He was caught, he was thrown in jail for a couple of weeks, and then he was sent back to Baltimore. And at the age of 20, on September 3rd, 1838, with the help of my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass. And I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about her because there would be no Fredrick Douglass without Anna in his life. She was the first person in her family to be born free. And she was a domestic servant in Baltimore. And Fredrick, as a teenage boy, they meet at some point. They start to care about each other, start to think about a future together. And Anna said, Fredrick, you're not meant to be a slave for life. And I don't want our children's father to be a slave. Had she not sold her personal belongings to help finances escape, had she not sewn the sailor's disguise that he would wear, who knows if he would have had the courage or the wherewithal to run away. And had that not happened, we would be a very different country sitting here today without the contributions of Fredrick Douglass as a great abolitionist advisor to President Lincoln during the Civil War. They were married for 44 years. They had 5 children together and 21 grandchildren. She was a radical freedom fighter in her own right. And she's been pushed aside in history. She's been erased from history, as have many women, but in particular black women. She ran the family. She made the decisions. She made sure the kids were being educated because Fredrick was constantly on the road speaking. And so I am just as proud of her as I am of him. And we're working very hard to lift up her life and legacy. And in 2025, there'll be a biography that'll be coming out, 750 pages on my great-great-great-grandmother. And so we're really excited about that. We actually produced a musical in Washington, D.C. called American Prophet. And when I started working with the creators of the musical, I said, I'll be involved with this, but Anna has to be shown as an equal partner in the struggle for freedom. And she was. And when people came to the show, including Ketanji Brown Jackson, who came twice and brought her staff, that's all they talked about was, we didn't know this about Anna. How did we not know this in history? So you're going to be hearing more about Anna. And again, for the students and other people in here, I hope that this little bit that I've talked about her will inspire you to want to learn more about her story. And so Fredrick escapes at the age of 20 by train and by boat. He lands in New York City. He writes a letter back for Anna to come join him. She would join him 2 weeks later. And with the help of conductors on the Underground Railroad, which was a network of people, places, and spaces working together to help freedom seekers make it to freedom, in particular after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law was signed, which was a compromise, which meant that enslavers had the right now to go into any state in the Union, free or slave, to recapture their property. It meant that those municipalities and law enforcement had to assist in finding those people. And then it also meant that if you were found to have helped to assist those people, you could lose your property, you could lose your freedom. And so in order for people to be free, especially if you were running from the Upper South, you had to go all the way to Canada to be free, where slavery had already been abolished. And so the Underground Railroad conductors point Fredrick and Anna to New Bedford, Massachusetts. They thought he might be able to get work there because he had acquired a skill as a ship caulker on the ship docks in Baltimore. They would arrive in New Bedford 2 weeks later. He would change his name from Frederick Bailey to Fredrick Douglass, so it would be harder for his enslaver to be able to track him down. In the age of 23, he and Anna attend an anti-slavery meeting on Nantucket Island. And they were just going there just to sit in the audience. And they knew that William Lloyd Garrison, I didn't have a tooth extracted, so I have no excuse. William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionist, was there with his supporters and followers. And they heard that they had in the audience what we would have called back then a fugitive slave. We call those people, again, freedom seekers. But in Fredrick Douglass, a fugitive slave, and they asked Fredrick, well, will you just stand up and tell the audience your story? Tell them what it was like to be enslaved. Again, he wrote in that autobiography of his, he said, I was so nervous that first time speaking in front of a white audience. He had honed his skills as a speaker in the churches in Baltimore, so he had some skills, but this was the first time in front of a white audience, and he said, I was shaking from every limb. But when he stood up, he had this natural gift for communication. He was eloquent. He was charismatic. He was good looking. He was well dressed. And he told his story in a way that nobody before him had ever done. Didn't have the ability to communicate in the way that he did. So he was asked to join the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as a paid lecturer, and he would go from town to town, city to city, just telling his story. But then he started to have a problem. And that problem was people doubted that he was ever enslaved. They couldn't wrap their minds around what they thought a slave looked and sounded like and what they were seeing in Fredrick Douglass, so they called him a fraud. So in order to prove he was who he claimed to be, again, he wrote this narrative. And in it, he named names and he named places. Then he had another problem. It became a bestseller. That's the last thing that you want, is the notoriety of a best-selling book if you're trying to hide from your enslaver, because it made him a celebrity and a household name, and they knew where he was every second of the day. And so it was suggested that he go to Europe on a speaking tour as kind of a cooling off period, and he would travel from England to Ireland to Scotland, and then he would land in this place called Newcastle upon Tyne in England, and with the help of his abolitionist supporters, they raised enough money to purchase his freedom from his enslaver for $711. It's a lot of money back then, probably the equivalent of over $40,000 today. And he was able to come back to the United States a free man. The family would settle in Rochester, New York, where he would begin to publish the North Star newspaper, which became the leading abolitionist voice. He became, as I said, an advisor to President Lincoln during the Civil War. And he and the other abolitionists were largely responsible for convincing Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, because if we know our Lincoln history, he was a politician and he was not quick to move toward emancipation. He did not consider black people equal to white people. There were really two questions in my mind. You had white abolitionists that believed that slavery was morally wrong, but they didn't necessarily believe that black people were equal to white people. And so we can't understate his importance during this time, during the Civil War, in pushing Lincoln to eventually make that decision. They met on at least 3 occasions. They became friends. When Lincoln was assassinated, his widow, Mary Todd Lincoln, gave Fredrick Douglass her husband's favorite walking stick, and that was passed down in the family. I remember taking it to school for show and tell, and nobody believed me that it was Lincoln's cane. And I got sent to the principal's office. So can you imagine being a little boy? The few times that I would tell people of my relationship when I was younger, nobody ever believed me. And I never thought that it was a point worth arguing. And so I really spent most of my life decisively disengaged from my lineage until Providence called in my own life. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. But I want to talk about Booker T. Washington, because he is as much a part of me as Fredrick and Anna are. He was born into slavery in Virginia. He benefited from the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he was 9 years old when he and his family were freed. He wanted to go to school so badly that he would work in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia at night so he could take his lessons during the day. And one night when he was in the mines, he heard these 2 older gentlemen talking about this place called Hampton Institute in Virginia. And they were talking about it as a place where formerly enslaved people could go and get an industrial education, learn how to do something, learn a trade, get a tool. And he had no concept of what that kind of education meant, but what he was hearing from these men, he literally thought Hampton was heaven. And so he would collect money, he would earn enough money, and with the help of community supporters, at the age of 16, he made a 500-mile walk to go to school at Hampton. And that walk took a long time. He ran out of money on several occasions. He had to take odd jobs along the way. He slept under bridges. He slept outside. But the importance of what he did and the message today is that there was no challenge too great for him to overcome. No obstacle that was insurmountable to getting an education. And so he finally gets to Hampton. He goes straight to the headmistress of the school, and she looks at him. He says, "I want to go to school here." And he's dirty, he's disheveled, his clothes are torn. And she said, "Young man, you're not worthy of admittance into this institution. Go on about your business." Well, he wasn't going to take no for an answer. So he came back the next day, and she shooed him away. And he kept coming back, and he kept coming back. And finally, she said, "Okay, all right, I can see you're not going to take no for an answer. Let's see, I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove yourself. Let's see what you can do." Well, down the hallway, she said, there's a dirty classroom. Go clean that, and I'll come in and check on you. Well, he had learned the value of hard work, working in those salt coal mines. And so he put those skills to the test, and he cleaned and cleaned. And when she came in to do the white glove test, which they used to do back in the day, some of you may remember, she's looking for dirt on the chairs, the tables, the windowsills. Not only couldn't she find dust or dirt, she couldn't find anything. That place was pristine. And so she looked at him, she said, okay, you've proven yourself worthy to admit into this school. He would start at the age of 16, graduate 3 years later, come back as a teacher, and in 1881, he got word that there was a group of people down in this place called Tuskegee, Alabama, that had some money to build a school modeled after Hampton, where formerly enslaved people could get an industrial education. Word got back to the group in Tuskegee that there was this young teacher at Hampton who would be a perfect principal, perfect founder for the school. Booker T accepted the position. He rushed down to Tuskegee, all excited to get to work, and he's looking around for an old schoolhouse or church somewhere where he could begin his lessons, and there was nothing but farmland and dirt as far as the eye could see. But he didn't get discouraged. He started recruiting students. He started getting them excited about getting an education. And then one of the first things that he taught them how to do was to tie their shoes, how to brush their teeth, hygiene. But he understood that coming out of 400 years of oppression and slavery and black people not being considered equal, that you weren't going to get people just to change their racist ideology overnight. But Booker T. Washington's philosophy was he was going to show black people how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles, develop strength of character, and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. And so Washington was a leader who brought stability in a time of transition from enslavement to freedom. And it may be said that he's the person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. So now here's where I come into the picture. So I'm 5 years old, and people ask me all the time, so did you always know? And my answer is, nobody ever sat me down and said, we've got something really important to tell you. I just always knew because I spent all of my summers in Fredrick Douglass's summer beach house, which was built on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay in a place called Highland Beach, Maryland. It was built by my great-great-grandfather, Charles Douglass, who was Frederick and Anna's youngest son. Charles was a real estate investor. Like his dad, Frederick, people don't know that about Frederick, but he was also a real estate investor. He had homes in Rochester and Baltimore. His house in Washington, D.C. right now is a National Park Service, a historic site. And so Charles purchased 40 acres on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay because he and his wife had tried to go to a white resort and they were turned away. And so he said, we're going to start our own resort. And so he started to parcel out those plots, and he saved one for his dad as a retirement home. And he said, Dad, are there any special features that you want in the house? And Frederick said, yes, I want it to be right on the water. I want it to point in a certain direction, and I want you to build a tower at the top. And what he wanted to do at the end of his life was sit in that tower, look back across the Chesapeake Bay, because on the other side you could see land. And that land is the eastern shore of Maryland, where he had been born into slavery and where he toiled away in chains. And even though he had suffered the inhumanity and brutality and exploitation of slavery, he understood that he needed to remember where he came from in order to know where he was headed. And so I spent all of my summers in that house, and there were images of my ancestors everywhere. And then I started to notice that my ancestors were on statues and money and postage stamps, and schools were named for them, bridges and libraries, and every once in a while, you know, we would go out and dedicate something. And so I would ask my friends and my classmates, are your grandparents on statues? And of course they would say no, and they wouldn't believe me. But the images were everywhere. And I remember there was this larger-than-life portrait in that home of Fredrick Douglass at the top of the stairs. And there was one night where I remember looking at the portrait, And I didn't know at that time that he was the most photographed American of the 19th century. I worked on a book with some scholars in 2015 called Picturing Fredrick Douglass, and we made the case that he was photographed more than Abraham Lincoln, more than Ulysses Grant, and his only contemporaries in the world that were photographed more than he was the British royal family. Because he understood at a very young age, at the age of 22, he took his first picture, that this new technology that he would come of age with, photography, he could use to help make his arguments for liberation and equality in addition to his oratory and his writings. He understood that he could be strategic because he's trying to counteract the notion in the public consciousness that people of African descent were not worthy of freedom, were not worthy of citizenship. The public and the federal government was saying, well, these people are from Africa, they're better off in slavery, they're getting the Christian religion, they're getting fed. Listen to the happy songs that they're singing. And there were all of these racist caricatures out there. So making a group an other to justify mistreating them, taking away their freedom, their humanity. Remember I said history is not just about the past, it's about the present. And I hear that kind of rhetoric today. They're coming to invade our country. They're coming to infest our country. History is not just about the past, it's also about the present, and it's about the future. And so he became the most photographed American of the 19th century. He said, when you look at a photograph of me, you're going to look me in the eyes and see my humanity. You're going to see that I'm worthy of freedom, worthy of citizenship, and I'm never going to look like a happy, amiable fugitive slave.
Amen.
Now we think about the Fredrick Douglass and visualize the Fredrick Douglass that history has given us, the white-haired, safe grandfatherly figure looking away from the camera. That's the whitewashed, sanitized version of Fredrick Douglass that history has given us. We don't always think about that abolitionist looking directly into the camera. And so that portrait, he's looking like that abolitionist with that fiery gaze and glare. And I remember looking at it, not understanding any of what I just shared with you, and I said, man, you look mean. And I remember thinking, I'm glad I didn't know you, because I had a great-grandmother that I knew that was mean. Is this live?
Do you want me to stop?
Yeah.
I will.
Okay. So,
Secret stuff.
as I would tiptoe past that portrait, you know what would happen? His eyes would follow me. And by the time I got down to the end of the hallway, I could feel that steely glare burning like fire on the back of my neck. And I always imagined in my little boy imagination this booming baritone voice, which he was said to have had, bellowing down upon my tiny person. And he would say to me, "You will do great things, young man." And I remember thinking, not me. I don't want any part of this. I had seen what the pressure had done to those that came before me. I told you about the happy love story and how my grandparents came together and got married after 3 months. But there's also a tragic side to that story. And that is my grandfather, Fredrick Douglass III, the namesake to one of this country's greatest heroes, the surgeon, always carried this weight of expectation on his shoulders. People expected him to be an iconic leader like his great-grandfather. But there's only one Fredrick Douglass. And when my grandmother was 3 months pregnant with my mother, that weight became too much for him to carry, and he took his own life. And so my mother was born without a father, raised without a father. And then when I came along, the first male in the family to have this dual lineage, my parents, grandparents, great-grandmothers, they weren't going to put that kind of pressure on me or my brother or my sister. They wanted to put up this kind of protective barrier to keep us protected from these very formidable legacies. And so, as I said earlier, I was disengaged from my ancestry until divine providence happened in my life. And that was in 2005. I read a National Geographic cover story, and the headline was 21st Century Slaves. And it was an article about human trafficking and modern day slavery existing all over the world, including right here in the United States and right here in San Diego. And that article floored me. I'd heard about slavery and sex trafficking, and I thought about it in far off places. So I wanted to learn more about it. And there was one night that changed the trajectory of my whole life. I was sitting in our living room, and I was reading another article about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service countless men almost every single day. And down the hallway, I could hear my daughters getting ready for bed, and my older daughter was 12, so she was the same age as this girl that I was reading about. My younger daughter was 9, and they were laughing and playing and about to get on their knees to say their prayers and to get tucked safely into bed. And my mind just starts racing, and I can't wrap my brain around what I'm reading and what I'm hearing. And I remember thinking to myself, that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is getting tucked safely into bed and not being forced into bed to service some sick individual. And so when I walked down the hallway into their room to say goodnight, I had this moment where I couldn't even look them in the eyes. And I couldn't look them in the eyes and walk away and not do something about this. And I understood right then and there that my ancestors have built a platform for us through struggle and through sacrifice. And perhaps we could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to do something about this issue. And I started thinking about that story where Fredrick heard his enslaver say education will unfit him to be a slave. And we started to look at the landscape of how the anti-trafficking community was working, and there was very good work being done, but it was mostly on the back end. After the victimization had occurred, after the crime had occurred, you rescue, you restore, you rehabilitate, law enforcement comes in, arrests, prosecutes. But as well-meaning as we were creating this cycle of exploitation where we're just rescuing and restoring, and that doesn't even count for the trauma and the cost to that young person that has had their childhood stolen away from them and will probably never get back to some semblance of wholeness, and the cost to the community. And so we thought, well, how can we unfit communities to allow slavery to exist and thrive today? And it's through education. So we have a partnership with 2 California-based nonprofit organizations called Protect. It's online training of educators. It's in San Diego. It's one of the first places that we've been, was in San Diego. It's K through 12, age-appropriate education. Educators, anybody that comes into contact with young people gets trained on how to implement the curricula in the classroom. And to date, it's the most comprehensive human trafficking prevention education program in the world.
Amen.
We've also worked on federal legislation. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which is the legislation that guides how the federal government responds internationally and domestically to trafficking, gets reauthorized every 4 years. And you'll hear that I said the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the afterword. Well, I thought when it was being reauthorized in 2018, which happened to be the year that we were celebrating Fredrick Douglass's bicentennial, I went to the lead lawmaker, Chris Smith, who's a legislator, our House member out of New Jersey. I knew he was a big Fredrick Douglass fan. I said, can we name this for Fredrick Douglass in his honor? And he said, yeah, that's a great idea. And then we offered to help write primary prevention language into that legislation. And we did, and we also got the title changed. So it's the Fredrick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act. With that came $78 million that was appropriated through the Department of Health and Human Services that went to 10 organizations that were doing primary prevention. It was really the first time that there was money out there for organizations to be able to do primary prevention education. So the legacy of Fredrick Douglass as the abolitionist continues on today in that work. For those of you that are getting our book, I'll tell you quickly about this project. We formed a publishing imprint with Simon & Schuster and Forefront Books in 2022. And we want to amplify the voices of Black and brown authors who are underrepresented in the publishing industry. And so I'm really proud of this imprint. It's called Fredrick Douglass Books. This was our first publication, which is the Douglass family edition of the narrative that I've been talking about, Fredrick Douglass's first autobiography. And we've made this a really special book. Douglass's narrative appears exactly as it did in 1845, but we also added some pieces. I wrote the foreword, my mother captioned some family photographs, and then Brian Stevenson, who is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, who also started the Legacy Lynching Memorial that's down there. He wrote a really powerful introduction for us, and he just makes that connection from what Fredrick Douglass was up against, and he draws a line through slavery, through Jim Crow, through lynching, through racial terror, all the way up to his issue that he works on, which is mass incarceration awareness. He's an attorney by trade, and he's worked to exonerate people that have been wrongfully convicted on death row. You may have seen a movie about him called Just Mercy, starring Michael B. Jordan. That's Bryan Stevenson. That's his life. So again, he wrote a really powerful introduction, and I'm really honored to sign and give copies away to those of you that are going to be able to get it. And if you can't get it today, you can go to our website, which is fdfi.org. It's the acronym for Fredrick Douglass Family Initiatives. So fdfi.org. Scroll down a little bit on the home page and you'll see a link where you can buy this, but it's available in wherever you can buy your books. It's tied to a project called 1 Million Abolitionists. We're working to give away 1 million copies of this book to young people all over the world. My whole life, I've had people of all ages come up to me with tears in their eyes. And as a little boy, I never understood the emotional connection that so many had to my ancestors, and they'd want to pinch my cheeks, give me a hug. And these old people are just crying over me. And it was many years I was talking to my mom, and she said, yeah, I had the same feeling. It was always weird. I never knew what that was about. And it wasn't until a woman came up to me after a presentation, and she said, I read Fredrick Douglass's narrative when I was in the 8th grade. It made me believe that I could do and be anything possible. It inspired me to be the leader that I am today. And if I could say thank you to your ancestors, I would, but since I can't, you become the conduit to saying thank you to them. So can I give you a hug? It happens all the time. And so I want to inspire 1 million young people to believe that they can do and be anything possible. And the way that we're giving these books away is through the help of corporations that are gifting money, foundational grants, individual donors. So if this is something that you're interested in, we also have curricula that goes along with this project. And to date, we've given away more than 100,000 books. We're a long way away from the million, but with your help, we will get to the million at some point. So that project is called 1 Million Abolitionists. Back to what Kim was talking about. History lives in each of us. History doesn't just live in me because I descend from 2 people that we've heard of, but history lives in each and every one of you. I remember when we started, a 10-year-old girl, I was in a classroom, and she's bouncing up and down in her chair, and she's raising her hand, holding her hand up. She's so excited to tell me something. And I call on her, and she said, Mr. Morris, I researched my family tree, and I found that my great, 4 greats, I thought I had a lot of greats, was born into slavery. She taught herself to read and write in secret, and she ran away, and she became a successful businesswoman in her community and a philanthropist, and she knew what that word meant, and she was really excited to share it with me. And so she said, so Mr. Morris, do you know what all of this means? And before I had a chance to respond, she said, it means I have greatness flowing through my veins just like you do.
Amen.
And every time I tell that story, just like now, I get chills. And I tell that story a lot because it's true. We all descend from somebody that made a difference, may have given of their lives just for the freedoms that we have in this country today, may have given of their lives just so that we can sit in a room like this together. And so greatness lives in each of us because we are the sons and daughters. We're the grandsons and granddaughters. Some of us are the products of slavery. This country is the product of slavery, but it's also the product of the abolition of slavery. And from Fredrick Douglass, we learned that we have a right to be free. And from Booker T. Washington, we learned how to make our way in the world as free citizens. And from Martin Luther King Jr., we learned that as free citizens, we have the same rights as all citizens. When I was growing up, the challenges faced by great people like my ancestors were apparent to me because it just so happens their blood flows through my veins. But the fact is, all of us, we live far from the cotton fields. And we're worried more about who's going to win the Super Bowl on Sunday than we are about the threat of being beaten by our overseers. We live in modern times, and the echoes of slavery are hard to hear from where we stand. But if we all listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from those people, those men, women, and mostly children, 40 million of them around the world, that are still enslaved today, many living in conditions as horrific as the slavery that I've been talking about, that my ancestors suffered and endured. And when we listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from all the young people out there that need hope, need inspiration. They need to know where they come from in order to know where they're headed. And it's not their fault that they don't know this history. I mean, we're living at a time in this country where we are as divided as we've been in a long time. And there's racist, sexist, xenophobic rhetoric that's out there. What will our great-great-great-grandchildren say about us 150 years from now in this moment in time? Both my ancestors had great quotes. Fredrick said, "You cannot tie a chain about the ankle of your fellow man without, alas, finding the other end fastened about your neck." He said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." And I would add to that, women. Booker T. Washington said, "If you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else." That's service in the community. Our umbrella theme for all of the work that we do is history, human rights, and the power of one. Power of one is service, is civic engagement, it's giving back in your communities, being inspired by these stories. Fredrick Douglass said, "Without struggle, there is no progress." And so we're in the midst of a mighty struggle right now, and another Kim word, obligation. We all have an obligation to carry our history forward. We have an obligation to make sure that we make the world a better place for those that are coming behind us and the next generation of leaders sitting at the table over here. History lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forth. And I'm going to close. My time is up here. I just want to tell you a quick story. I was born in Washington, D.C. I told you about spending my summers in Fredrick Douglass's summer beach house, but I also used to visit his home, which is the National Historic Site in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and we would go on field trips there. And I loved that house. There were two rooms that I loved. The first one was a library. And in the library, he's got thousands of volumes of books. And I remember going into that library as a little boy and thinking, never spent one day of his life in a classroom, but he read everything he could get his hands on. He read everything. But my favorite room was upstairs, and that's down the hallway, and that's his bedroom. And you know how when you go into a museum, they always have that velvet rope that blocks off the rooms so you can't sit down on the furniture or touch anything? So from the hallway into his bedroom is one of those red velvet ropes. And when I was a little boy, I always wanted to see what was in that room. And so I would stick my neck over the rope, and if I looked to the left, I could see his bed. And on his bed is his nightshirt. And next to the bed on a chair is his hat. And on the floor next to the chair is a pair of his shoes. I always wanted to sneak past that rope and try those shoes on. So when we started our organization in 2007, the very first talk I gave was in the visitor center of that home. And I told that story. And the site manager of the home said, when I finished my presentation, she said, "I've got a great idea. Let's go on a special VIP tour." And so there were about 25 students. There were some teachers and parents. And so we rushed up the hill into the house, and I'm knocking the kids over because I wanted to show them the library. And then follow me, and we rush up the stairs and down the hallway, and there's that rope that's been staring at me for 40 plus years. And the site manager did something that they never done before. She took down the rope and she said, "Come on in." So it's not a big room, 35, 40 of us in there. We were packed together. And then the photographer wanted to take a group picture, and he started placing people, and he said, "You stand here, and you stand here, and why don't you stand over here?" And when he got to me, do you know where he put me?
In his shoes.
Did you say in the shoes? Now get that visual. Pick me up and put me in the shoes. Put me right next to the shoes. And so we're taking the photograph, and then I looked down and I went, there they are. After all of these years, all I would have to do is just slip off my shoes, step right into them, and no one would ever know. And I'm saying to myself, smiling, finally, I'm in Fredrick Douglass's shoes. But I never did. I know. I never tried those shoes on because I knew that they wouldn't fit. Those shoes are too big for any of us to fit into. But what I realized at that moment was that I can take the shoes that I've got. You all can take the shoes that you've got. And we can lead the way to a brighter future. We can lead the way to a better tomorrow. And each and every one of us can model the freedom fighters of our choice and go on to affect change in the world around us and for generations to come. And with that, I thank you all very much for inviting me to be a part of this morning. It's been my honor and my privilege to be here. Thank you.